Okay.
Sweet. So it looks like we're recording now, and we'll get started in a minute.
And Matt, I'm still feeling okay.
Okay, good.
Thanks for looking at
If you have to duck out, we'll jump in.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is just 1 o'clock here in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and we're going to start today's webinar on pruning. And we're fortunate to have two speakers today, Klodd, who's an extension educator in fruit crops for the state of Minnesota, and Amaya Atucha, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin and extension specialist in horticulture and in fruit crops. And so today they're going to go through frequently asked questions or facts, FAQs, about pruning cold climate grapes. And so these are questions that they get quite regularly, and hoping that this is a concise place to answer those questions, show some great examples. So as we go through today's webinar, you won't be able to unmute yourself or talk physically, but you can use the Q&A or the chat to ask questions. And I'm Matt Clark, I'm from the University of Minnesota, and I'm going to be monitoring those questions as they come through. And if I can, I'll just interrupt Annie and Amaya where appropriate. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end to answer those questions or other things that pop up. So without further ado, Annie is going to start our discussion today, so I'll just hand it over to her. Thanks for attending.
Thanks. And that was kind of confusing because I shared my screen first, but Amaya is actually going to start.
Oh.
So.
Okay, so I'm gonna start sharing. Just give me one. There we go. Can you guys see the screen?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks, Matt, for the introduction. And so today, I guess we're kicking off our webinar series that we will have during the growing season that is titled "What to Do Now in the Vineyard." And so this first webinar, as Matt was saying, we're going to try to address some questions that we usually get from growers. And thanks to Annie for just distilling into the most important. And so we're just going to get right to it. And one of the most frequent questions that we get, especially with the cold climate hybrids, is should basal notes or non-count buds be counted when we prune? And so the first thing that I want to talk about is what does it mean a count bud versus a non-count bud or a basal bud. And so when we talk about, and this is a really good picture, when we talk here about buds, you can see this bud here is actually breaking, and it's a double bud, but I want you to focus on the position where this bud is. So this is a 1-year cane that produced a shoot last year, and this is probably a 2-year cane from the year before. And so this bud that is right in this position here would be what we refer to as a count bud. It's a fruitful bud. It's going to have inflorescence and clusters, and it's the bud that we would normally retain during the dormant pruning, and it comes again from a node position that is distinctly separately from the wood that is 2-year-old. So it comes right from the cane from last year or the shoot that grew last year. In contrast, a basal or a non-count bud that you can see here in green is a bud that is much smaller and is located where the 1-year-old wood contacts the older wood, in this case, the 2-year-old. So right here on the base. And this question always comes up when we're pruning. And the reason that we get that question is because in these cold climate hybrids, those basal buds, so you can see here, all these shoots coming out, this basal bud right there is actually fruitful. So you can see here how it has inflorescence. And in the majority of the cases, my experience with all the cold climate cultivars that we have in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, most of them will carry 2 clusters, just as a regular count bud. That is not the case in other cultivars, and especially in vinifera and maybe other hybrids, not cold climate hybrids, that the basal buds are not necessarily fruitful. And so the recommendation, the traditional recommendation, if you look at the literature for vinifera, is that those buds are not counted in the total buds that you would leave during dormant pruning. But in the case of the cold climate grapes, we actually count them. When I go out and I prune, here's a good example. You can see on the image on the left side, this spur, when it was pruned, there was 1 and 2 count notes that were left. But you can see here how the basal bud is also going to be breaking and is also going to be carrying clusters. What this means is that instead of having 2 shoots with 2 clusters, what I'm going to end up having in this particular spur is 3 of them, and I'm going to have to come back to do some shoot thinning if I ended up having too many shoots and going over the count or our target number of shoots. In this case, on the right, what you can see here is this spur is much shorter. There was 1 count bud, but you can see here the basal bud is also breaking. So here I'm going to have 2, and this is the type of pruning that I normally do for cold climates. And I don't know if Annie would like to, make some comments about what she recommends to growers. I know that in the past we've discussed this, but the recommendation of counting the basal bud is what I usually do in a year where I'm sure that I won't have any cold damage. So if we have a mild winter and I'm sure that there will be no damage, then in that case, I ended up leaving shorter spurs with 1 count bud, assuming that the basal bud is going to break. In the years where there's substantial cold damage, and we'll talk about, I might just leave 2 count buds. So again, those are the buds that are distinctly separated from the older wood. And then if everything breaks, we ended up having 3, because it might be that one of these ones is damaged.
And Amaya, I don't have anything to add because you said exactly what I was going to say. We're on the same page there.
Great, perfect. Okay, so that is one of the questions that leads to the next one, is actually how to estimate bud survival. Because they said, like, if we had damage in our buds, we would leave 2 of the count buds, and hopefully the basal bud would also break if one of those were to be damaged. So the important thing here is to actually find some time before you decide to prune to look at damage on the buds. And so the question is, what's the best way of doing this? The first thing is that you really need to take representative samples of canes to be able to dissect them to look at the buds. And when you are sampling, the important thing is to sample canes from vines that represent the majority that you have in your vineyard or in a particular block, but also to make sure that you are taking samples from low and high spots in the vineyard, because in spots that might be lowered spots, it's going to get colder and you're probably going to have more damage in those than in higher spots in the vineyard. And so if you only take from higher spots, you're going to end up probably leaving less buds because you think that there's less damage than what there actually is. So if you have distinctive areas within your vineyard, make sure that you sample separate. And so what you want to do is you want to select, again, canes that you will normally leave for fruiting, or canes that you would spare. So what I mean with that is you don't want to select canes that are either bull canes, because those canes we know that tend to have more cold damage, but you also don't want to select canes that are very weak. So here's an example of a vine that is a VSP, but this is exactly the same for high wire cordon. There's no difference here. I know that a lot of my pictures are on VSP, but they're totally applicable to high cordon as well, or any other training system that you have. And so if you're sparing here, if you have a system in which you're using spurs and not cane, you're actually really interested to sample and to dissect buds that are going to be in the positions at least 3 to 8, so that you don't have to remove the entire cane. If you have plenty of canes, then I would say remove the cane completely and make sure that you can dissect the buds that are in the first positions, because those are actually the ones that you're going to end up leaving during the dormant pruning, and those are the ones that you want to make sure that are not damaged. My recommendation is to sample at least 100 buds, to dissect at least 100 buds, to have a good representative sample. And what you can do is collect around 20 canes, and you would collect canes from that have node positions between 3 or 8, or you can collect the entire cane if you want, and you can dissect those first node as well. Then what you want to do with those canes after you collected those canes is that you want to bring them inside and let them thaw or warm up to room temperature, just because that is a better way of expressing damage, especially if this has happened after we get a really cold temperature event. You want those vines and the canes and the buds to warm up to express any potential damage. So after you do that, what you need to know when you're dissecting buds is that grape buds are what we call compound buds. Inside those buds, there are 3 different buds, 3 meristems that can produce 3 potential shoots. So you have the primary that is right here, you can see in this image, is the bigger one. And in the case of most cultivars, is the one, and species of grape, is the one that is going to be most fruitful, is the one that is going to have more clusters. The secondary, that is the one here, is on the side of the primary, and it's a little bit smaller. In the case of hybrids, cold climate hybrids, the secondary bud breaks with the primary. So in some of those pictures that I said that you were looking at, there were 2 shoots coming out of one bud. In the case of vinifera, that only happens when the primary bud is damaged by cold. So if this gets damaged, then the secondary would break. In our cold climate hybrids, I see a lot of times that both buds can break. So out of 1 count bud, you can actually have 2 shoots. And this secondary also carries clusters, so it's also fruitful. And then you have a third bud, the tertiary bud right here, that is much smaller, and that usually never carries any inflorescence or it would not produce any clusters, it's just vegetative growth. So this is what you see when you dissect. These are longitudinal cuts, and these are equatorial cuts of the buds. And you can see here how these are really nice and green. And these ones right here have damage that you can see is expressed as this brown, sometimes black, dehydrated, while this one here, the tertiary bud that only produces a shoot without any fruit, is alive. So the primary bud is always the most sensitive to cold damage because it's the bigger one, and it's the one that has the highest amount of water. And so when it gets really cold, it's the one that's going to freeze the first. And then the secondary and then the tertiary is the one that survives the coldest temperatures because it's the smallest. So what I'm going to show you next, and I hope it works well, is a video that one of my graduate students, Mike North, did from dissecting buds. So basically what you need to dissect this bud is just a razor blade. And the buds are relatively big, so you don't need a magnifying glass, but in some cases that could help just really look closer to see if you have any damage. And so I'm gonna run this video, and then I'm gonna point out a couple of things. So here we go. So he is cutting from the top, small and thin slices, and then you can see here the primary bud and the secondary and the tertiary bud. There are 3 of them, they're green, they're healthy. And then he's taking here another bud and it's going to start dissecting from the very tip and just taking very thin slice just to go in depth looking at the different buds. And the reason why is because not all buds are in the same plane. So the primary bud, I'm gonna run it again because I'm gonna stop it. I want to show you something. When he does the first cut on the surface right there. Oh, sorry. Well, this is another one. This is kind of complicated, but here we go again. So there we go. So when he does the first cut and he removes the first layer. Oh, for some reason, I can't stop the video.
I don't think it will let you pause it on a scene.
Okay. Well, maybe we can see it clearly on this one, but this one is almost the same as well. I'm gonna turn the video there. what I want you to see is that he's taking this first one, and then you can see only two buds, the primary and the secondary, but then he's gonna take another slice of that bud, and then you can start seeing that the tertiary is gonna appear because it's deeper in the bud. So here, the primary has damage, is brown, and the secondary is green. So you can see that this is a dead primary bud. And then the tertiary is just going to be appearing all the way here. So you need to start taking a small little, there you go. See, you can see it right there. That's the tertiary. But also I wanted to show you that this had a lot of damage at the very beginning, and now it looks green. And the reason why is because the deeper you go, you ended up removing the entire primary bud, and you are cutting into the connecting tissue to the cane. And so that is still green, but that doesn't mean that this bud is alive. So when you start cutting, that's the reason why, and I'm gonna play it again. If you take you need to be careful to take with a very sharp razor blade on the very top and start looking, there's when you see that it's damaged. And the more you keep taking a slice and going deeper and deeper, you're going to remove the entire primary bud, and you're gonna get to the tissue that connects the base of the bud to the cane. And so that is gonna be green because that connection is not damaged, but the bud itself, you can still see here by the third one, is damaged. I hope that that makes sense. And so that's why you wanna start from the very top, taking several thin slides just to make sure that you're looking at all the buds. And so after you've done this, you're taking your canes into your house at room temperature, and then you start sliding them. Then you count how many of these buds are damaged and how many are alive and they look green. So how can you, the next question is, how can you adjust the number of buds that you would leave when you're pruning, when you're dormant pruning? So if you do this exercise and you figure out that between 10 to 15% of the primary buds of those that you dissected were dead, we usually don't recommend to do any adjustment to your winter pruning because that's normal. To get 10 to 15% of the buds that have damage is going to be normal, and you really don't need to make any adjustment for that. Now, when you start going up in the number of buds that were dead, to between 20 to 40% of all the buds, we usually recommend to leave, maybe 25% more buds than you would normally leave. So for example, there's two ways that you can manage this. If you leave, 2 to 3 buds per spare when you are pruning, that would mean that if you want to leave, 25% more, maybe you want to leave 1 extra bud for each one of those spurs. So instead of counting the base, instead of counting 2, you add a third one, and that way you increase the number of buds that you have, accounting for the damage that you have. The other way that you can do it is that if, for example, you leave 40 buds per vine, if you want to add a 25%, that means that there are 10 more buds, and so that means that instead of leaving 40 buds per vine, you're going to leave 50 buds per vine. So that's how you can make that calculation. If you have extensive damage, between 50 to 60% of the buds that you dissected were damaged, then the recommendation would be to double the number of buds. So if you leave 40 buds per vine and you have that amount of damage, you want to leave 80 buds per vine. And then if you have more than 60% of damage in your bud dissections, then in that case, you really want to do a minimal pruning. And what you want to do is sort of like a long pruning, leave all of the canes that you have, just spur them down to maybe 5 buds. And that will be the best way to try to get some crop, because if you don't, then what you going to end up having is a lot of vegetative growth, and you just want to balance. So that is, the general recommendation. Now, the following question to this is, well, what is the best thing to do? Should we leave longer spurs with more buds, or should we leave more spurs, or should I leave extra canes that I can lay down across the cordon because maybe a lot of my spurs are dead and I want to replace that cordon? So how do you do that? So again, if there's damage, what should I do? Leave more buds per spur, more spurs, or extra canes? So if you decide to leave more buds per spur, one of the problems, and that's why I put this picture here, is that you need to be aware of apical dominance. What does that mean? It means that the bud in the spur that is on the highest position, so in this case, you would see the buds that are all the way up here are going to break and produce a shoot, and they're going to inhibit some of the lower buds from breaking and producing shoots. So the longer the spur you leave, the higher chances that only the buds on the very top are going to break. Then the other issue with sometimes leaving longer spurs is that you ended up with spurs like this, that they're too long because you left too many, and they are, creeping out of the cordon. And so that can be problematic when you ended up leaving too much buds. But in a case of damage, that is, if you have too much cold damage, is an absolutely available option to leave more buds per spur. Leaving extra spurs, which is another possibility, can be difficult. Can be more difficult to find new spurs or new canes from the cordon to make them as spurs than to leave more buds in a spur itself. So this, again, I put this image because it has the two issues. One, that these spurs are becoming too long because too many buds were left. But in this case, also, you can see that there's two new canes coming from the base of these spurs that if you wanted to leave extra spur to account for the damage, you can just go on and prune here and make them these new spurs. And in that way, you're increasing the overall number of buds that you're leaving. So that is also a possibility if you have new canes coming from the base of a spur or from the cordon itself, then you can also spur those to increase the number of buds that you're leaving. What I like to do sometimes is I recommend to lay an extra cane. So if you have a cane that is coming from the cordon, the top of the trunk where the two cordons come out, that looks healthy and that you can preserve it completely, or at least leave, maybe 10 to 12 buds, and you can lay it down for a potential having more shoots coming out of that. It's sort of like a parallel cordon. That is a good way of increasing the number of buds that you're going to leave if you have a lot of cold damage, but also of potentially replacing the cordon if the cordon itself has a lot of damage. And I borrowed a picture from John, so that he has this picture here, very nice, that illustrates that. You see this cane right here? You could totally spur this cane, but if you were to have a lot of damage, you can also lay this cane right down here, parallel to what seems to be what is the cordon, and you can tie it down. And in this case, you are increasing the number of buds by just laying this cane. And if this cordon has a lot of damage, well, what you can do during the spring when you see that all of those buds break is just come and cut this old cordon and use this as your new cordon. On the contrary, and that's why I like to leave an extra cane, is that if all of the buds that you leave in this original cordon are healthy and they break and you have all of the shoots that you need, you can also come back and just cut off this cane really easy. So it's kind of like an easy way of like an insurance of leaving extra buds this way by leaving a cane, but also if you have 60% of damage in your assessment of bud mortality, it could also mean that some of your cordons can also have damage. So leaving a healthy cane or several healthy canes that you can come back afterwards if you don't need them, and just with 1 or 2 cuts remove them, I think it's a good alternative. So what can you do if you have a lot of damage? 3 things. Either you leave more buds per spurs, or you can leave more spurs if you have canes that you can spur, or you can lay an extra cane or maybe 2 per cordon that would increase the number of buds, but also potentially be a new cordon if you need to replace it.
Maya, before you
And
move, can I ask,
yeah,
before you move on, there's a couple of questions I think are great. So Mark
sure.
asked, when you're going to lay down this new extra cane, do you tie it down at the time of pruning, or do you come back later in spring to do it?
I usually tie them down during the time of pruning. Then I leave the entire work done, and then I come back in the spring and look at it. And if I don't need it, I just go and take it out right away. But I lay it because afterwards sometimes you forget about it.
Exactly. Could you go back 2 slides? There's a question about preventing spur creep. So I just want to bring it up because here's a great picture. So the question is, what's your recommendation for counting basal nodes in relation to preventing spur creep? And then the comment is, I find myself keeping bud options closer to the cordon for that purpose.
Yes, that's always the way that I look at it. When I go and I prune, I always think about choosing, the canes or the spurs canes to spur that they are the closest to the cordon as possible. So even if this cane might look fantastic, I would not leave it because it's just too far away, and I would just, take out this entire spur and maybe spur this cane that looks, a little bit better than this one that is a little bit bulky. But yes, I always do that. I try to avoid, creeping out of the cordon.
And then just now that it's here, can you explain apical dominance one more time?
Okay, so I think that grapes might be a kind of like a harder way of explaining it. But if you think about, maybe a tree that you have in your backyard, trees always want to grow like, on height. So if you have, let's say, a cane, in this case, let's say you have this cane right here, and this cane has, this bud here, this one here, and another one up here. If you were to go and cut and make a cut right here when you're pruning and leave all of these buds right here, the one on the very top is the one that's going to break the first. And when that bud breaks and starts producing new vegetation and new leaves, it's going to start producing a hormone that's called, I'm not going to get specific, but it's going to start producing some chemicals that are going to go down this cane, and it's going to inhibit these buds from breaking because this one wants to take the lead. So the longer you leave it, especially when you have a spur, not so much when you lay them down, because when you lay them down, you are inhibiting the movement of this hormone. What's going to happen is that the buds that are on the very top are going to break preferentially, and these ones are going to stay dormant. And so that's the problem when you leave too many buds on a spur. And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a few questions that are coming in, so thank you for those, and we'll leave those till after the end of the presentation at this point.
That's all I had.
Oh,
that's
perfect.
all I had. So it was, I think I'm right on time.
So yeah, I think as Annie transitions, she might answer a couple of these as we go. So
Yep.
We'll keep an eye on them.
Okay. Great. So I'm just gonna, there was my intro slide, same as Amaya's. So I'm just gonna keep going with the momentum that we already have. The next frequently asked question, and there are 7 total, by the way, that we're going over today. So Amaya just covered, I believe, 3 or 4 of the questions that we wanted to talk about. So here's another one. How do I grow up a new trunk or cordon after a vine died back? So after it got injury, usually to winter injury or trunk disease. And this question came up a lot in 2019 in Minnesota because of the polar vortex we got. If you're not from our region, what happened was at the end of January, beginning of February, we had 2 or 3 days with extreme low temperatures between -20 and -40 throughout our state. And so some vineyards, especially vineyards in really low-lying flat areas where that cold air accumulates, they had a lot of dieback. And so what we're looking at here is a Marquette vineyard where almost all of the vines died back to the point where they completely needed to be replaced via the suckers. And so this wasn't a case where the vines were dug out and replanted with new vines, but the vineyard manager regrew them from the suckers. So here's the mostly dead vine. You can see a lot of the spurs had died. There's just a lot of empty space, or what we call blind wood, along those cordons, and you can see only a few shoots coming up here and there. The other thing is that some of those shoots were really stunted. So we knew that, especially if you see this one right here, probably a secondary or a tertiary, and probably won't amount to much at that point in the season. So what you're going to do here when you need to replace a trunk or establish a new vine from scratch, you're using those suckers that are coming up at the base of the vine. And there's a tremendous amount of variability in how many suckers a vine produces. And so we're going to go through a few different scenarios of when you have a vigorous vine with a lot of suckers, or a medium vigor vine and a really low vigor vine where there aren't many suckers to choose from. But here's a couple examples of what we tended to see in summer 2019 after that really severe cold event. All right, so here's the first example with a low vigor vine. These are again during dormant pruning. So these photos were taken in the spring, in March, once all the snow had melted and it was easy to get to the base of those vines, to get to those suckers. It's easiest to do it then when you can see everything you're working with. So this vine here, these are all Itasca, by the way, the 3 examples I'm going to show, but it goes for any of the varieties that we're talking about. This vine, for whatever reason, tended to be very low vigor, and we see this is the cane. This was just a 2-year-old vine, by the way, that had died. So you can see the mature cane that was trying to be trained as a trunk, and then you can see about 1, 2, 3 suckers coming up. And so what we did was we cut off the old one that had died, and then we had 3 left. So you're going to choose, sometimes you keep all 3, sometimes you just choose 2, depending on the vigor of the vine. Since this was a very young vine, we just chose 2. And so we chose the 2 that were healthiest. So I've got this one over to the left. It's looking pretty healthy. It's got really nice bud spacing. And then this one to the right would be the second healthiest. This one in the middle, not so healthy. It was really spindly. So what you do is you're going to tape those up. You can use a tapiner or your egg ties. And then instead of leaving the full length of those canes, you're going to go ahead and cut those back to the point where they're about pencil diameter. Sometimes that means you can leave several feet before it gets pencil diameter or less. Sometimes you want to cut it just back to just a couple of buds. Sometimes I hear people say that they cut all of their suckers back to 2 buds whenever they're establishing new vines. This really isn't necessary as a general rule. If your canes or if your suckers maintain good health and good girth for a longer period of time, there is no need to cut those back to just 2 buds. You can leave more buds because that leaves you more options for which ones are going to produce shoots and continue the length of your trunk. So we've got these 2 cut back to where they're healthy, and either one or both of those is going to be selected the next growing season to become our new trunk or our new trunks. Maybe we have 2 trunks. All right, here's an example of a slightly more vigorous vine. So you can see these canes grew to several feet long. We're growing along the wire. And so again, we just chose the 2 that looked the healthiest. And we were choosing those as 2 separate suckers. We didn't want to choose 2 canes that were coming out of the same base, the same second-year cane. We wanted to make sure that we were taking 2 separate suckers from the ground. And so you can see we chose the 2 healthiest and just basically trained one direction, one the other. And I cut those at the point at which it got skinnier than about a pencil. And so at this point, we didn't need to cut them back too far. It was healthy enough that we could go ahead and lay some of that length down. Here's a slightly more vigorous example now. So it gets a little more complicated here. Again, this was a 2-year vine where it had a lot of dieback. And so again, we don't want to take 2 canes from the same trunk in this case, because ideally in this system, we wanted to have 2 trunks. We wanted to have double trunks. And so I chose 1 cane from this 2-year-old wood that was nice and healthy. And then I took another sucker from the ground to become my second trunk. Now, if there was no other good sucker from the ground to take, what I could have done is taken 2 healthy canes from this trunk that we're starting to establish, put one direction on the cordon, one the other direction of the cordon. But in this case, most of the healthy canes were coming from pretty low down on that new trunk because a lot of the wood on the upper side of that trunk had died back. And if I chose two canes that are that low down to the ground, about 1.5 feet from the ground, that crotch angle is going to be very low. And ideally, we would want that to be higher. So what we're doing here is we've got this trunk and the cordon going one direction. And the next season, there will hopefully be shoots coming out from around here in that crotch. And we can choose one of them to go the other way, or we take this sucker that's now our second trunk and have that go the other direction if it's successful. Here's an even more vigorous example, little repetition here for, just so you understand the consistency of this process. Again, we just chose two that were coming out separately, not from the same main trunk, chose one to go one direction and one to go the other direction. And we're choosing those based on which ones seem the healthiest, have good bud spacing, have good girth, but we don't want to choose bull cane. So you don't want to choose one that's too thick because that indicates that it's a bull cane and it's not going to be, not going to have very good longevity or fruitfulness. But in this case, these two worked out pretty well for us. And so in this case, I could have cut these probably a little further down, but a good rule of thumb is to leave about 15 inches down on a new cordon and cut it off there. And sometimes maybe your trunk is okay and you don't need to replace the vine from the ground with new suckers, but sometimes just a cordon will die. And so in this case, we were replacing a cordon on a young vine that had died back. And I think this is a vineyard where there was a lot of rain the season before. And then it was a low-lying area, so it had a lot of winter damage. And there were a lot of dead cordons in this vineyard. And so we did a lot of cordon renewal. And in this case, we've got a cane. I don't know if this is a sucker or if it's coming out of the trunk, but basically we cut off that dead cordon and replaced it with this 1-year-old cane. And then I cut it off, as you can see, somewhere about 15 inches, maybe 2 feet down on that cordon. Whenever I make a cut at the end of a renewal cane, ideally what you want to do is do that cut about an inch or so past a really healthy, alive bud. And so you can see this bud, it's an outward facing bud, meaning that when this starts growing into a shoot, that shoot is probably going to grow at an angle sort of like this. And that means that next year, when I want to take that shoot and use it to create the rest of my cordon, it's going to be fairly easy to tie that down. And so we do the cut again, just about an inch past that. You don't want to do it too flush with the bud, or when after you make that cut, it's going to dry out a bit. You don't want to make that cut too close to it, or that cut could actually dry out and kill the bud. All right, so the next question is, how do I decide when to replace a dying cordon? So those past pictures we were going through when you really need to establish something from scratch, but what about on a mature vine when a cordon dies? So I'm going to show a few examples here. This is an example of a vine where you can see most of this cordon is not productive. It looks like these spur positions have died for the most part. And we just have this one spur position at the end of the cordon that looks like it has a healthy live cane growing out of it. And so a cordon like this, if you just left that cordon from year to year and just relied on this one cane at the end to be producing your fruit, you're doing yourself a disservice because this could all be producing fruit and it's not. So if you're doing that habitually, you're reducing the yield of that vineyard. And so in this case, we don't want to keep that unproductive cordon. And I know we can become kind of attached to them sometimes, but it's not doing us any good. We don't need to be sentimental about our old cordons. So in this case, I might keep this cordon, but I'm going to lay down a renewal cane next to it. The reason I chose to keep this in this case, which you don't have to do, is because we do get a little bit of fruit off of this one on the end. But I see this good sucker, nice and healthy sucker coming out of the ground. I'm just going to take that down and pin it down right next to this cordon, and they're going to grow parallel. But again, If you prefer, you could also just cut that cordon off completely. In this case, we're trying to make the decision if this cordon is healthy enough to keep, or if it's time to replace it, or put a renewal cane down next to it and let them grow parallel. So I'm looking at how many live spurs, how many productive spurs do we have, and what is the spacing between them? So these yellow arrows represent the space, the unproductive space between fruitful spurs. So here you have, this might be about 7 inches or so between fruitful spurs. And over here you've got maybe 8 inches. You can tell that there was a spur position here that had died. If I take my cursor over here, there was clearly a spur position here that had died. And so this cordon is about maybe half as fruitful, at least this part of the cordon would be half as fruitful as it potentially could be. And so I see this really nice cane here. Now, this is obviously was taken during the growing season, but you can pretend that it's the pruning season and it's dormant. You see this really nice healthy cane here. This would be one where during the dormant season, you could think about laying this one down parallel to the cordon and growing them side by side, because this one is going to be fruitful and it's going to help you fill in fruit in those empty spaces. All right, so then the question is, when should you just replace cordons versus when should you replace an entire vine? I get this question several times a year, and there's no exact fine line, and it may differ depending on who you ask, but you just have to think about how dead is the vine, and what are the chances that that vine is going to remain productive if I just keep it. In this case, this is an example I showed earlier of when there was a lot of winter injury. So we've got about 16 inches along the cordon here with absolutely nothing growing. And at the end of it, all we have is maybe this is a tertiary shoot that's not very vigorous, probably isn't going to produce fruit. Got a lot of space here, quite a few empty spaces all along that vine. And if you look in the vineyard around the vine, all of those vines aren't doing very well either. And so this is a case where I'm not just going to keep trying to renew these cordons with shoots. I'm going to actually take up suckers to become new trunks. And then once those suckers are established into new trunks and cordons, like what we showed earlier, then you can go ahead and cut down that vine. It's not going to be very productive. You could even make the decision to go ahead and cut down that vine right now and start with just the suckers, because this vine is probably only going to produce 1 or 2 clusters from right here. So it's not really worth keeping unless you really want to get a little bit of fruit off of that vine. The next question is, do I need to prune out the old dead spurs and stumps of old canes from the vine? You know, when you're out pruning and you see a lot of dead stuff like this, those can get really ratty and accumulate over time. Something else that I want to point out that's interesting in this photo, you see all of these aerial roots. I get questions a lot from growers sending me pictures of these, asking what they are. And often during the growing season, they're actually quite plump and almost red in color. And in this picture, they have dried up. So those are called aerial roots. And aerial roots themselves are not going to do any damage to the vine, but they're a sign that the vine is stressed. Usually it means there's a lot of humidity and that vine is trying to actually put out roots and get water from the air. Not that that's going to be effective, but it's just a sign that the vine is being really stressed, usually way too much water. So that's just a side note about aerial roots. But it's a good idea when you have all this dead stuff to prune that out during your dormant pruning. This dead wood can actually harbor diseases over time. Things like black rot and phomopsis and anthracnose can hide out in that scraggy wood from year to year. And so if you have time when you're pruning, go ahead and cut those out. Sometimes when I'm working with new pruners, maybe you're going slower because it's your first or second time pruning. I might say, for the sake of time, just get all of the main part of your pruning done, and then you can come back and get this dead stuff. But if you're an experienced pruner and you know how long it's going to take you, it's a good idea to just cut this out as you're pruning so you don't have to come back again later in the season and get that. The second question, and I'll have Amaya jump in on this one too, and Matt, if you want to, does it matter what time in the season I prune? And what happens if I prune very early or very late? I think that there might be some myths around this, and it's very complicated. So I think we should just have a little bit of a discussion on this. And here's a picture from this year, January 11th, 2021, of a vineyard in Minnesota doing their pruning on new vines that they had planted the year before. The advantage of doing an early pruning, starting in January and finishing by, say, early February, is this can really minimize the risk of grapevine trunk disease infection into your vines. I'm not sure how many people on here have been to webinars where we were talking about grapevine trunk disease, but these are diseases where there's fungal spores in the air that are actually infecting pruning wounds that you make on the vine. And so if you're pruning really late, like March or April, those fungi are more active because it's warmer outside and they need that warmth and moisture in the air to be active. And they're going to infect those pruning wounds. If you prune early like this in January, those pruning wounds have a chance to dry up before a lot of those trunk disease fungi are active. So you might be reducing the amount of trunk disease infection into your vines if you can get it done really early in the winter. But if you prune that early, I wouldn't prune too aggressively because it was January, we didn't know if we were going to have a polar vortex event, an extreme cold weather event later in the season. So if we pruned everything really aggressively, we might be kicking ourselves later on when we don't have enough extra buds to make up for that bud injury. So you might leave a few, you might do just a long pruning, leave 4 or 5 buds per spur and then come back later and get the rest of those spurs. So Amaya, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I agree with you. I mean, this is a question that I get a lot, not only from grape growers, from especially apple growers. I mean, I understand if I were a grower and I had the time, I just want to go and get the job done. And so the recommendation has always been not to do any pruning in the middle of the winter, not to do any pruning in the fall, and to wait as long as possible for the spring, with the idea that early pruning would stimulate some activity around the area where you made the cut, and that would make either the tree, in this case the vines, more susceptible to cold damage. But the truth is that when you go back and you try to look at the literature to find where that idea came from, there's nothing. It just doesn't exist. And I'm gonna kind of like explain this from the physiological point of view. If you look at the cane and you look at those buds, and we were dissecting those buds in the winter when they are dormant, they are separated to the main cane. There's a layer that forms there that isolates them from water moving. And so they're kind of like their own little pocket there. And when you cut into the cane, really nothing is going to affect those buds. Now, the only problem that you might have is that when the winter is really, really cold and extremely dry, that cut, there might be some desiccation at the end of that cane. So maybe in the first 2 inches right where you made the cut, there could be some desiccation. And if there's a bud there, that bud might potentially desiccate a little bit and then might not break. So the idea that Annie said, that to maybe do a longer pruning, it's great, because if that were to happen, if you do this in January, or even if you do it in December, and you get a really cold winter and you get some desiccation, it doesn't matter, you just left extra material just to go back and recut. So the truth is that there's no clear evidence that early pruning would increase cold damage at all in vines or in trees either. Now you want to make sure that they are dormant, so you're not going to start pruning in October. But even if you start pruning in late December, those vines are, they're completely dormant. And so if you take in consideration that you're not going to prune to the exact number of buds that you need, but you're going to leave some extra just in case there might be some damage or very cold temperatures, that would be just fine. I don't think that there's any problem. And we see that because we actually do prune a lot our vines to do some of these cold studies. And sometimes we ended up with, at the end of February, we just only have long spurs that maybe have only 5 buds left, because we had to take all of the other material to do our studies. And those vines are just fine during the growing season. They never have any issues.
And then this is just an interesting picture. I'm sure many people have seen something like this before. If you're pruning really, really late in the season and you see the sap start flowing out of the vines, that's just a sign that the grapevines have exited dormancy. The ground has started thawing to the point where the vine's roots can be active and taking up water. So that's a sign that they're starting to begin the stages of breaking their dormancy. And that means for us, it's time to finish up our pruning. And so we have plenty of time for questions. And while you're writing your questions in, I'll just list a few resources first. This one at the bottom, actually, I want to point out first. A lot of you have probably gotten emails about this. We have a workshop with the Frame Network, which is specialists from a number of universities teaching about fungicide program development. So when you're thinking about what fungicides are you spraying, how are you choosing those fungicides based on your diseases, and how are you diversifying them through the years? This is going to be a really good workshop. It's an afternoon workshop. They're offering it on March 2nd and March 4th. So you only have to do one of those days. It's just we're offering it 2 days to make it more available to more people. So this is the link here to sign up for that. And maybe Matt or somebody could type that in the chat so you can click on it. They still have plenty of spaces in that workshop, and the deadline is this Friday to sign up. The reason why the sign up deadline is Friday is because they're actually going to mail you a binder of materials to use during the class. And so in order to mail those out, they need you to sign up by Friday. So if you've seen this and you've thought, oh yeah, I want to do that, make sure you really get your registration in. And so here's some resources. We have a lot of videos on pruning, webinar recordings, other things, both on the U of M Extension Small Farms channel and the Wisconsin Fruit channels on YouTube. And then we both universities have newsletters. We've got the U of M Extension Fruit and Vegetable News, and then there's a Wisconsin Fruit News blog. We also have the enology.uofm.edu blog. So check all of those out if you haven't.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Amaya. There's a bunch of questions. I'm going to see if I can consolidate a few. One, someone would like define bull cane. Second, when do you remove them? And third, can you remove them from the root? You know, many of them come right from the ground.
Okay, so and I actually tried to go out and take pictures of bull canes before this webinar, and I couldn't find any at the research center because they're very good about removing them. But bull canes are usually much thicker than the width of a pencil. Typically, they're very, very, very long. So you'll often see them growing all the way into the next vine over or beyond. They are sometimes not completely round. They'll have almost an oval shape to them as they grow. And the bud positions are usually very far apart. Instead of your buds being about 3 inches apart like we want, they'll be more like, let's say 5 to 7 inches apart.
And you can remove them pretty much any time, right?
Yes.
Anytime you see them in the growing season or dormant,
Mm-hmm.
they're not great for the vine to keep carrying around. There's a great question at the beginning. Kevin asked, how do you get rid of tendrils off catch wires? That maybe someone has a good answer for that.
Not to accumulate them. Make sure not to accumulate them. And every single time that you're pruning, you just have to remove them. And if you don't, they just start accumulating. And that's when you end up with those like wires full of them. There's no easy way. I have not found anything, just with the pruners. The only way.
And I'm gonna, while we're doing questions, I'm gonna put up the evaluation poll. If you could just tell us how we did today. Thank you.
Annie, you brought up doing long pruning. How many buds would you leave in that case? 5, is 5 enough?
Yeah, I think 5 is good. Sometimes 6, you know, I think Amaya said before between about 4 and 8, but I think, yeah, 8 would probably be a little much.
Yeah, I would say between 5 and 6.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to read through some of these. So whoever feels like they know the answer. My vineyard uses a high wire trellis system. My vines have 1 trunk and 2 cordons going each way. Should I have only 1 cordon going each way? Is there a downside to having 4?
Right, and that question was posted before we started the webinar today. So I'm wondering if some of that was answered for you when we were talking about sometimes if a cordon is starting to die, and spur positions are dead, you can lay down another cane next to it to create a second cordon where that will fill in the empty space where there's no fruit from the first cordon. And so that's a time where you can have two next to each other. But that's only really necessary if you do have an issue of dieback. Typically, one cordon going each direction is sufficient. Amaya, do you have anything to add? Or Matt?
It will depend also on the training system. There's some training systems, like if you just have a high wire, you can only have, I would only recommend to have two cordons, one on each direction. If you're trying to do something like a Geneva double cordon and you want to increase the number of cordons because you want to double the production that you have in that vine, well, then you will have to assess how vigorous your vines are, if they're able, or if you're in a site that is really vigorous. Some of our cold climate hybrids, you know, they can work well in having double canopies, but again, that also depends on your site. If you have soils that tend to be more sandy and they're not that vigorous, then it might not be a good idea. So that's the only reason why I would change to 4, but then you would have to obviously just change also your trellis system. You just can't have two cordons, one next to another. You will just have a jungle.
Great. There's a question here from Joe who says, when the canes start getting too tall away from the cordon, the shoots start too high, like in a VSP. So maybe that means a spur is getting too tall away from the cordon. Can you cut off the cane closer to the cordon and a new shoot will come out of that location, or will it just die? So I think the question—
There's a new— Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, maybe to rephrase it, I think he is asking about, sorry, no, I'm totally blank what I was going to say. Go ahead.
Spur creep. He's talking about spur creep, right?
Spur pruning.
If the spur is too long and then the cane is, the new canes, the 1-year-old growth is too high, if you just go ahead and you cut that spur from the very base and you don't have anything else that has grown from that, then you're eliminating your spur and you're not sure that you will have what we call a dormant bud, a bud that you can not really see that would produce a new cane from there. So I wouldn't do that. I would only remove the spur if you have a cane coming from the base. Because if you take it off all the way touching the cordon and you don't have new growth, just cutting it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to promote new growth. It might be that you ended up with blind wood right there without any production. So I will be careful with that.
So if you've
got a cordon where a lot of your spurs are starting to creep and it's starting to get really messy, that might be time to start replacing that cordon and laying a cane down next to it.
Exactly. Here's a longer question. With new or regrowing vines, how long do you let the suckers grow free while establishing trunks and cordons? Is there a good rule of thumb for how much to prune a vigorous young vine in general?
For me, in my experience here in our research vineyards, where we have very, very fertile soils and we ended up having a lot of vigor, is that for younger vines, I like to leave more canes. So if I plant them and they grow, I would select probably between 4 to 5 of those canes to move them up, to tie them up, to start forming my cordons. Because if I cut them only to 2, those 2 are going to become really vigorous and they might produce some bull canes. So I try to contain the vigor of the new vine by leaving more shoots and then selecting ones, I have more options. If I were to be in a vineyard that doesn't have very fertile soils and you can see that based on the diameter of your canes. If you have canes that are very small diameter and weak, then you want to leave less, because the more you let, the more competition you'll have. And so that's how you can balance how many you have. And I don't know if Annie.
Yeah, that's something I guess I forgot to talk about that I meant to when I was talking about rebuilding trunks from vines that had died back. I meant to mention that not to just leave 2 suckers, but to let several suckers grow up. Basically, 4 or 5, or sometimes even as many as you have, if it's a really vigorous vine, just to prevent those bull canes.
We're getting right about 2, but I think we have a few questions, and I think if we go over time, I think that's okay. There's a question for someone who just planted vines last May. How many buds should they be leaving this year while pruning? Or what's a good
Sure.
cane diameter that they should be looking at for those trunks?
Sure. So yeah, that was, if you think back to when I was talking about pruning back those 1 or 2 year old vines, I showed those 3 scenarios with a low vigor vine, medium, and high vigor. Those were newly planted vines that we were pruning back. So you don't need to leave a certain number of buds as a rule of thumb, because if you try to go with a certain number of buds for every vine, some vines are going to be a lot healthier than others, and you're going to be at a disadvantage. You're probably going to be cutting too much off some of the vines and leaving too much on others. So instead of thinking about pruning every vine equally, think about being equitable with those vines. If they're smaller and weaker and they need more help, leave fewer buds. So those few buds that are alive have a better chance and the energy can be focused there. So I don't like to go by a number of buds. I like to go by the cane diameter. And when you see those suckers or those canes getting less than a pencil diameter thick, that's the point where you want to cut.
And then a great question. How far from the bud should you be making your pruning cut?
Oh yeah, I think we both tried to cover that a bit, right? So I showed a picture where we were pruning in the early spring, about March, and we were leaving it 1 inch past the last bud. But Amaya, you had talked about that as well.
If you're going to do it very early on, you might want to leave more. You might want to leave 2, because some of that is going to desiccate in the winter. So it depends when are you doing your pruning. So, but if you're doing the traditional one in like March or April, if you push it all the way to April, 1 is just fine. But going back to what Annie was saying, I think that the pruning of young vines is individual pruning. Like, it's an individual decision that you have to make and assess the one by one the vines before you make the decision. There's not a formula that all the vines are going to be the same.
Yeah. And I still, on the Facebook groups and stuff with grape growers, I still see people saying you need to cut all of your vines back to 2 buds. And it's a goal of mine to have people not say that anymore. I don't know where that came from, but it's way too general.
Yeah, I agree 100%. If you have a healthy plant, what's the point of pruning it?
Right.
What time of year can I prune suckers from the trunk and ground? Oh, I think I covered that. Prune them anytime you want.
Yeah.
I have an old disease vine. So I prune these now and wait for a sucker to come up in spring, or should you, what's your recommendation there? Take it down to 2 feet so you kind of know where that plant is. So when the snow melts away, you can look for the suckers then.
Wait till the snow melts away so you can find the suckers.
Yeah, I mean, they're hoping to get new suckers in the coming year.
Right. If you're doing anything with suckers, I would wait until some of the snow melts so you can see what you're dealing with and see how many options you have.
It's likely you have suckers from the previous year and
Probably,
you see what's coming up.
Desuckering.
And then if you were to not have anything and you still want to promote suckers, then removing just the cordons and keeping the trunk will stimulate a lot of growth on the very top, but it also will stimulate new suckers from the base. So if you're in that case in which you have a vine that has just a tiny little bit of growth here and there, what you might want to do is just go ahead, remove both of the cordons, and then that will stimulate that this growing season you're going to have a lot of suckers from the top, but also from the base of the vine, and then you can choose from those the following year during your spring, during your dormant pruning to retrain the vine.
Great, thank you. There's a question if the slides are going to be available to download after this.
Usually what we do is we just send out the recording, but I don't know, Amaya and I, maybe we can talk about that if we want to have our slides available. I don't think I have any issue with that. Do you?
I don't, but I have videos and the videos are embedded, so I don't think that the videos are going to be available, but we will have the recording in the YouTube channel.
Oh, right.
For people
Great.
to revisit.
And then Rich, who I think is in Montana, asked if the frame workshop is going to cover organics. I'm pretty sure Michelle was going to cover that. Michelle Moya from Washington State and Leslie and others are going to cover that topic. And then just as a comment, this workshop is targeted for Midwest, and I think there are other workshops coming or being presented for other regions. Is that correct?
I don't know what other regions they're doing the frame workshop in this year, but historically they've done them all over the country, and this is the first time it's been in the Midwest. So
Okay, thanks
yeah.
for, yeah, so Richard, maybe you could ask Michelle that question directly, while you're applying. Jameson asks, what's the best trellis for box pruning? Not really sure. I don't have any answer to that.
I don't think I know what's box pruning.
Is he just talking about like basically hedging everything off, like a really?
Jameson, if you want to,
Yeah.
if you're still here, if you can ask that question in a slightly different way, that'd be great. Then there's a question, typically on new vines like year 2, do you remove the fruit? Year 3 and 4, how many buds are advisable to leave on to bear fruit?
On year 2, yes, I don't leave any fruit on year 2, but on year 3, I would leave some fruit. And it always depends on the vigor of your vine. Again, it's like a one-by-one case. It's not a formula, because in some cases, we have vines. I want to say a good example is Atucha. So we planted Atucha, and our Atucha are super vigorous. And so if you have a really vigorous vine and you get a lot of bulk canes and you're taking out the fruit out of it, what's the point? What you're doing is you're taking out the fruit and encouraging more vegetative growth than what you need. So you need to balance it by, if you can leave some fruit, that's going to take away some of that vigor and control the vegetative growth, especially if you already established the cordon. So if you have a really vigorous vine on year 3, you can absolutely leave some fruit to kind of balance it. Now, if your vine is not well established, you don't have the cordons yet, you don't have anything, then no, don't leave fruit, so that you make sure that you're able to establish that completely. Because if not, you're going to end up with short cordons or not complete vines, and then you're just overall reducing the productivity, the long-term productivity of the vineyard.
Exactly. Jameson's follow-up was mechanical pruning.
Okay.
I'm still not sure if he means trellis or training system. Those are two very different questions. Maybe we'll just follow up one-on-one with you, Jameson, on what your question is. There was a comment from someone from Northern Europe that was saying that there's a claim that if you do late pruning, there's increased sap flow, and that's dangerous, especially if you might get a late frost. Is that true?
I actually got last year a picture from one of our growers that had a lot of sap flow, and it got really cold, and it's just actually like a sword of ice coming out of it. It got all frozen. It's just sap that it was fine. Nothing happened. It just thawed afterwards, and the vines were just fine. So I don't think that's an issue. I mean, I've never heard that. The ice can propagate inside the canes without any problem. So I don't see that would be a problem.
Yeah. And then is there anything that you should be doing to more or less keep the vines cool, protect them from that warm sun in the spring, to keep them from waking up too early? And Annie's shaking her head. People might try to sell you a product to spray. There's not great evidence that those work either. You just have
to. Maria Smith, next week at the Cold Climate Conference, the Minnesota Grape Grower Conference, Maria Smith from Ohio State University is going to be giving a talk about methods to use in the spring to protect against freeze damage. And she's going to be talking about what works and what doesn't work, because there's a lot of stuff out there that's being promoted that doesn't work. But there are a couple tactics that do work. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I think it is a really important topic. I would, go. I'm sure that Matt was just sharing that link. Yep.
I did. Yep.
Yeah, I'm just saying that it really, it's not going to make any difference, because when you say protecting them from the sun, it's true that when the sun hits the vines, the tissue warms up. But really, the process of deacclimation or losing the hardiness of the buds and breaking, it's much more complicated than just that. So it's just not worth doing any of those things.
We have time for one last question. Is there any concern if snow drifts are over top of the entire vines?
Concern for what exactly, like bud survival?
I'm not sure.
Really.
I can't think of any
If
problems.
anything, I would say if anything, the better. Like if you have your entire vine covered by snow, wonderful. You have a wonderful free isolation like layer that is going to keep them warmer than if they were exposed to, you know, the wind and the colder temperatures.
Yeah, they might be pretty well insulated. Well, thank you to our experts for presenting. There's some nice comments in the chat thanking you for that. This has been very helpful. Again, if there are other questions, feel free to follow up with Annie or Amaya or myself if you want to. And then I put in those links, so hopefully that's useful for you all. And if you
look
can,
up the Cold Climate Conference next week.
yeah, it's coming up quickly. So if you can register for that, we have some great speakers from all around the country who are slated to talk about enology, viticulture, and then also a session on in the tasting room, wine business section. So great.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.